Hello, and I would like to welcome all of you to this session of Raisina Dialogue 2021. And the central theme that this session will be looking at is change globalization, unshackling lifelines, unclogging supply chains. So we will be looking at supply chains and the questions arising out of that. The pandemic year challenged almost all our assumptions, be it social, political, economic. The global pandemic really affected globalization, slowing down some of the global trends that were the guiding principles of globalization, and some of the global trends that were a given. For example, easy travel, easy trade, cross-border pipelines and energy grids, seamless global communications, all of these were a given, and the world was really moving towards it until the pandemic put a brake on it. It actually, the pandemic undermined the convictions, the certainties, and the certitudes that have driven decades of, or at least 2 decades of globalization. It disrupted the supply chains, and most of the countries were compelled to turn insular and look inwards and become and focus on self-reliance. But at the same time, this pandemic also forced us to think and raise the question that the world probably needs to come back together and cooperate better and at a larger scale. It also compelled the states and the organizations to acknowledge that their global value chains and economic codependence had embedded social and political consequences. So, having said that, where does globalization really stand today? In this pandemic world, we are still dealing with the pandemic in many countries. What is the future of globalization? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And to talk about all this, we have a very esteemed panel with us. I would like to welcome Manish Tiwari, Member of Parliament, India, Chung Jae-cho, Deputy President of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, Soren Gate, Member of European Parliament, Melissa Conley-Tyler, Research Fellow, Asia Institute, University of Melbourne, Australia, La E-chung, President, Prospect Foundation. A very warm welcome to all of you, and I am Nagma Seher. Let's begin this discussion, and I would, if I may, come to you first, Melissa, and we talk about the supply chain. So the supply chain in a globalized world were made effective by many fundamentals, and it was based on many fundamentals like easy travel and easy trade and really very few impediments. But the pandemic, as we all know, forced the nations to close down borders, to put curbs on trade, because there were concerns and people were worried, and most countries turned insular because there were concerns. So now the question is that have these efficiency arguments that sustained the pre-pandemic supply chain been colored by security concerns during and after pandemic? Your views on that?
Look, I think if you're inclined to be suspicious of globalisation, the pandemic has given you another talking point in your arguments for protectionism. But if I look at 2020, the story I see is one of resilience. In Australia, it was gin distilleries making hand sanitizer or fashion brands making masks. What I see is a global economy that adjusted and managed. Australia is a great example of a country that is highly dependent upon global supply. We don't make very much. Our economy is dependent on minerals, agriculture, tourism, education, all very hard hit. And we coped. The government has asked our independent body, our Productivity Commission, to assess where the vulnerabilities are for Australia in global supply chain, and it just brought out its interim report. What I found very interesting was when it was looking at imports and the disruption of imports, it found that most of the essential goods and services that Australia uses don't actually depend critically on vulnerable imported products. There's a couple of exceptions in pure chemicals and in some personal protective equipment, but broadly, we're not so critically vulnerable as you might think. And interestingly, what the Productivity Commission came up with was looking at who should manage that risk. Their view is that these risks are best managed by firms, by the market. They have both the incentives and both the information to manage those risks. So my argument would be a country, even as, looks like it would be as vulnerable as Australia, can see it like that. I think other countries can too.
Absolutely. If I may put that question to you, Soren Gade, a member of European Parliament, that how do you think all these security concerns really affected the fundamentals of the global supply chains, the efficiencies of the global supply chain?
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, there's no doubt that we have to reflect on what has happened in the last year, and we have to learn the right lessons. And if you look into the right lessons, it is not for me or for the European Union, it is not to go back to a more protectionism on a global scale. I mean, I do not stand for that, and I can say that the European Union certainly does not stand for that. We have to realize that global trade has, as no other instrument, led to an increase in living standards. And but we also have to realize that even though we have a unique opportunity to make sure that global trade helps sustainable development, protecting the environment, and there's no longer a kind of contradiction with growth and trade. And that is some of those things we have to, lessons learned, we have to take into consideration, because more protectionism will not do anything good, not even in global security. I mean, if we do more trade, if we face it and realize that we have to meet the challenges together in the future, I think there will be less tension in those areas where we have seen tension rise before the pandemic. So I think we can use it in a positive way if we do it right, and if we take the right conclusions of what has happened in the last 15 months. Thank you.
Absolutely. Manish Tiwari, if you can take that question, and all the fundamentals which made the global supply chain efficient were actually challenged. In fact, all our assumptions and beliefs were challenged. So most of the countries were concerned, and rightly so, about security concerns, which is why the borders were closed and trade became more difficult. Do you think really of course supply chains have been affected, but what are the big problems? What are the real opportunities and the challenges to this?
Well, thank you, Nadma, for that question. See, if you were to try and rewind back a little, globalization had its moment in the sun, or its golden period from 1990 to 2008, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the erstwhile East European communist nations. But with the global economic meltdown of 2008, globalization started coming under a fair amount of stress. And that stress only exacerbated with the Eurozone crisis and the subsequent events, which led to the rise of right-wing populism all across the world. What the pandemic has really done, and I think that's the big elephant in the room, is make us ask ourselves the question, does China still continue to be a responsible global actor and a reliable supplier since now going back more than 3 decades? One of the greatest beneficiaries of globalization has been the move of manufacturing to China, beginning 1979 or 1980 when they started opening up. And these questions have risen in the context that once COVID-19 broke out, the opacity around both its genesis and proliferation, questions which still continue to remain unanswered. And unfortunately, the probe of the World Health Organization also seems to be more of an exercise in a whitewash rather than arriving at certain substantive conclusions. It lends, or feeds into these questions with regard to the reliability of globalization. Coupled with that, the manner in which China has acted during the pandemic, the declaration of administrative districts in the South China Sea, the move on the sovereignty of Hong Kong, the intrusions along across the line of actual control with India, all that has, and in addition to that, of course, leveraging medical supplies for political purposes, all that has led to these very valid concerns manifesting themselves. Now, the question is that would a diversification of supply chains be a welcome development? The answer obviously is yes. If there is more diversity of supply, that is something which actually strengthens globalization also. But is it going to happen on its own? I do not think so, because after all, logistics have been in place now over 3 or 4 decades, and global commerce has been used to a certain manner of functioning. So it's not going to be an automatic process, just because you've had a pandemic and there are concerns, it's not going to trigger it off. There'll have to be a concerted effort by countries and governments if they want this diversification to take place. And here you will have economics actually following government policy, and not really, not economics really leading this trend. So this, of course, is the subject of a wider discussion. And since we have a paucity of time, I'll stop here with my preliminary observations.
Absolutely. I will come back to the challenges and opportunities of diversification, but your views first, Mr. Cho, on the challenges to globalization now, or how was globalization affected really by the pandemic? Do you think it was affected? Manish Tiwari spoke about the slowdown that we were already witnessing, the world was witnessing in many areas of globalization because of the economic meltdown. So how do you think the pandemic affected this?
Okay, thank you. Recently, the risk of the severance of the global supply chain is rising, and the reason are various. First, the unanticipated events such as natural disasters and disease, especially the pandemics like COVID-19. And second, with the advance of the digital and data economy, the production and the use of related equipment and devices have a close bearing on a country's national security. The transboundary movement of goods and the services and activities in cross-border movement investment include technology transfer. Therefore, a country may tend to severe to chain of the export or investment, considering the risk of the leakage of sensitive technology abroad from the within. Yeah. So, against such the backdrops, I would like to underline the principles in selecting the right path to respond to recently increased risk of supply chain disruptions. The first principle is striking balance and harmony between the economic efficiency and resilience. Mm-hmm. If we overestimate the risk of the disruption of the supply chain, exaggerating this beyond what is actually the case, and therefore put too much importance on resilience, this can trigger enormous loss of economic welfare, both at the domestic and international level. This can lead to a drop of enterprise revenues and contractions in trade volume and production scale. The second principle is the reinforcing the resilience of the supply chain on the basis of firm trust. if one has insufficient information on a counterpart who is one part of a link in the supply chain, and if the counterpart lacks credibility, it would be difficult to evaluate the risk of disruptions. Distrust against partners will mean that they attempt to decouple from the production network.
I would like to move on to Mr. La A. Chung here. And Mr. Chung, you know, the pandemic exposed the fault of over-dependence, and suddenly nations found themselves vulnerable. Nations had to fend for themselves, and there was a time when the pandemic struck that many countries, we know, we were not even manufacturing the PPE kits or the ventilators. So the kind of over-dependence that we had on certain countries, that came to the foreground, and hence the question that how do we diversify? There is a need definitely to diversify and unclog the supply chains. So what are the opportunities that you see, and what are the challenges? Definitely there is a need, but how does one go about it? Your views on this?
Yes, I think the issue about the danger or the risk associated with this supply chain globalization and the pandemic definitely highlights the risks associated with it. And I think you are right that it has been accelerated or been amplified due to the over dependence on one or several producers in the whole world. That is basically right now we are talking about China. China not only is the biggest manufacturer in the whole world, but virtually manufacture majority of their products or the essentials for almost all the world products. And the issue of the pandemic, if that hits China very strong, like last year, and the global supply chain definitely will be affected. But I have also need to say that the globalization under the challenge came before the pandemic. And we know that before the pandemic already, not only a US-China trade war, but also the discussion about the supply chain security was already in place, where it first manifests itself in the 5G and the IC products. And then later on, we move on to other fields. And I think that the development has something to do with the weaponization of the interdependence, especially in terms of the production interdependence, that China is willing to use it. So that started to highlight and force other countries to do something in response. Then, of course, later on, the pandemic sort of come in and started to highlight and amplify other aspects of the problems. I think personally that in order to do away with this, of course, right now people are talking about sort of like a two trajectory. The first trajectory is about to establish a trusted supply chain, but which basically is to address the issue before the pandemic about the weaponization of the production supply chain that China was using, and so the correspondence, the measures was trying to produce enacted kind of a strategic supply chain in order to face this challenge. But that itself is not going to address the pandemic, the kind of pandemic that has brought to the fore about the supply chain risk issues. So another thing, I think the diversification, of course, that's a lot of people that are talking about. If we are able to add more suppliers so that the supply chain can be diversified, and we are not going to rely on just one or just several producers, that could ameliorate or lessen the risk itself.
Sure.
This could reduce somewhat, but I personally think that there's another new development that is about the advancement of technology, especially on the 3D printing and others. That itself could also change the whole process about production supply chain itself. This is something that we need to explore, how the new technology can help us to provide the kind of solution that we are facing right now.
Absolutely. Melissa, Tyler, your views on that, the challenges to diversification of supply chain. We are all now aware of the need and how important it is to diversify supply chain, and the over dependence that we saw, which the pandemic exposed us to, the over dependence on certain countries and the problems that it creates. Like Mr. Cho was just pointing out, that you have to add more suppliers, and that kind of will lessen the risk. So what are the challenges really, and what are your views on it? Are there opportunities to diversify the supply chain, and the need to diversify is very pressing right now?
Well, look, I'd look at those challenges in two levels. One is for individual companies and firms, and the other is for government. Now, for individual companies, it's part of their risk management, and they've got a whole range of tools they can use. They can stockpile some critical elements. They can supply or diversify, absolutely. They can do contingent contracting. They can build domestic capability, and that's something that each individual firm should look at. One of the things they might decide to do is shorten some supply chains if they're worried about the overarching environment. Now, if you're thinking more about what government should do, and I think that's what Mr. Tuari was speaking about, I think that's a very difficult area. Trade goes where trade wants to go, and trying to push into a command economy has enormous costs for the well-being of society. I mean, Dr. Park, I think, would be, Dr. Cho should be a great example. If you look at, say, at the astonishing human trial that took place on the Korean Peninsula, when a country was divided in half, and half of it's run on a market basis and half of it's run on a command economy. You know, you just need to see a photo of the peninsula at night to see how that worked out, let alone things like stunting and malnutrition. So for me, it's an empirical question rather than an ideological one. It's a question of how do we best meet human welfare? And that could be command, it could be market. You don't know until you try. But empirically, the answer is that markets work best, with three provisos. And I will give my three provisos. You have to actively counter inequality, because markets create inequality. You have to actively counter monopoly and corruption, and you have to make sure that externalities are being taken into account, specifically the environment and future generations. So there's a huge role for government in regulating markets, in redistributing and creating equality, in preventing abuse, and in safeguarding future generations. But government should not try to do what markets do. We know that government doesn't do it well.
All right, Manish Tiwari, your views on that. What can the government really do? And like Melissa pointed out, trade goes where trade wants to go, and there's not much the governments can do, and the governments don't do it very well. But, you know, this pandemic also actually raised the question and exposed all of us to the fact that we need to focus more on welfare state. And there was a question of should societies be more libertarian? What are your views? What can the governments do? What are the challenges to diversification? Do you see opportunities? There are some sectors which probably it will be easier to diversify the supply chain there. What are those sectors?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that North Korea is a bad example of a command economy, for the simple reason that the problem with North Korea is not economic. The problem is the kind of regime that is there in North Korea. So therefore, I would not dwell on it at any great length. You see, again, you need to rewind back in time. Why did manufacturing shift to China? Mm-hmm. The reason why manufacturing shifted from the West essentially to China, because A, it was cheaper to manufacture, and B, there was no regulation. So there were no labor standards, there was no oversight. You could pretty well do what you wanted, you know, pay wages which were suboptimal, and essentially make, if I can put it in those words, extremely mercantile profits. And so therefore it worked for the bottom lines of companies across the world, and that's why you had that shift taking place. Now the problem is that China has started using that kind of leverage for purposes which are not linked to commerce. And therefore there is a difficulty. And that's why I am saying that you will, if let's suppose governments are concerned that yes, there is a problem, it is not that diversification will not happen on its own. It will have to be regulation led. It will have to be regulation driven. For example, in India, though we are in the opposition currently, the government did put certain restrictions in order to get the balance of trade in order. And those restrictions have led to diversification internally within India itself. So therefore, this theory that globalization is really the panacea for all the problems which ail the world, I'm sorry, I'm not a subscriber to that ideological thought process at all. I think the pandemic has exposed some very, very serious inadequacies in which the flow of global trade is structured. And if we are going to be oblivious about it, and if we are going to think that it will be business as usual once the pandemic has passed, well, according to me, we will do it at our own peril. And so therefore, as governments are getting together to deliberate on questions of security, how to keep the sea lanes of communication open, how to ensure that irresponsible behavior by rising or emerging powers does not completely and absolutely upset the global order, I think the diversification of global supply chains will have to be an agenda item of, if not equal, but possibly even more priority, because the past 1 year, I don't think has been really a great experience. And just to finish off, the one experience that we have in India over the past 1 year, and as a public representative, I can say it, I have the constituency I represent as 20 million people, that what worked in the pandemic was not the private healthcare system. What worked in the pandemic was the public healthcare system. In fact, the private healthcare providers shut down their hospitals and ran away. And so I think on a number of counts, this theory that markets know best, let's leave it to the markets. I think that fundamental postulate needs to be challenged.
All right. If I look and come back to the supply chain question of do supply chains, there is probably no disagreement the supply chains need diversification, and over-dependence is not the answer. This pandemic has raised those questions and we need to look at it. There are questions raised in globalization, but probably globalization needs to reorient itself and we see a reset that's taking place. If I may come to Mr. Soren Gade and ask you this question. There are some sectors that will be probably easier to diversify, and there are some sectors which will probably face more challenges. Can you really dwell on that? What are those sectors that will find it easier when we talk of diversifying the supply chains? And also now that the economy is shifting to digital in most places sooner than later, how will the impulse to diversify play out in the realms of digital economy?
Yeah, first of all, being in politics, people do matters, and I fully agree with one of the former speakers saying that we are not looking into business as usual. I have to stress that protectionism is not the answer. It will create a loss of growth and a loss of welfare. And if, as a politician, if we look into it, in a few days' time, the European Union will present the new Indo-Pacific strategy. A few weeks ago, we shared our views on how we see multilateralism progressing. And in 3 weeks from now, the next summit meeting between the European Union and India will take place in Portugal. So we can look into the future and we can say, okay, multilateralism is dead, or we can look into the future saying it is more important than ever. And of course, you have a very important point on the digitalization, it is really on the agenda in the European Parliament and among the leaders in Europe. And we do know that this is the next step, so to speak. We have a lot of companies in Europe. They have a lot of companies in India, for example, because India is really in front when it comes to education in digitalization and had a lot of skilled engineers and people. So, of course, this will change also the supply chain system. But again, of course, the market is so important. But as I said before, people, they do matters, and even politicians can sometimes make a difference. And I think it is important that the politicians stand up and say, we should not use the pandemic and what has happened in the last year to go back to protectionism. We should use it in a new way, and we have to realize that is more trade, it is more digitalization. If we want the world to develop, if we want welfare for more people in the world, if we want growth, and we should have the healthy growth. We should not have the one of the former speakers said that was in charge in China right from the beginning. I mean, we have to make sure that trade do what it should do, working for better conditions for workers, and making sure that it is a sustainable development that will come out of it. That was maybe a political answer, but that's the business I'm in. So. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chung Jae Cho, if I may come to you, if your views on how do we really unshackle these supply chains and unclog these lifelines. The pandemic exposed the problems. There are challenges of how to go ahead with it. There is also, as I had asked an earlier speaker, the question about what are the sectors which will find it easier to diversify and the challenges, and now how will this diversification play out in the realms of digital economy?
Okay, thank you again. I'm sorry there is some internet problem, but now before I talked on the challenge of the disruption in supply chain because of like COVID-19 or something. So I already talked about give you kind of some principles. The one is I already talked to you the striking balance and harmony between the economic efficiency and resilience.
Yes.
And second is reinforcing the resilience of the supply chain on the basis of firm trust. And lastly, I would like to emphasize our response to the risk of the disruption of the supply chain should not deprive the developing countries of the chance to prosper. Many of them have incorporated into the global value chain and have upgraded their standing in it. The Korea and India are exemplary case. So if disruption may also be lost, this would push developing countries wishing to upgrade the manufacturing capability and achieve economic prosperity down the ladder. Thank you.
All right. Now, when we have all talked about the challenges, all the speakers have pointed out what are the challenges and what are the solutions really when we look at the diversification of supply chain. Now, we know that from globalization during this pandemic, we actually moved towards deglobalization, and now there is also a pressing need for the world to come together and cooperate in a better way. We know that we cannot just sink or swim alone. We have to sink or swim together. And this has been reiterated by this pandemic more than ever. Now, what kind of political and institutional solutions can countries frame to navigate the era of deglobalization and restore that equitable global value chain? The focus here should be on equitable global value chains. So I would like to put this question to Mr. Chung, if you would like to take this.
Well, those are difficult ones. But I think the process actually right now, I believe that it forced the government to take a bigger role. I have to say that although there's associated with the globalization, there's a belief that the market will adjust itself. But I think in the last 20 years or so, we do not see the market is just adjusting itself. Actually, the market is adjusting to what the government was doing. And one of prime example is that we look at the China, and China has a state-supported policy to build out its manufacturing capabilities. And what the world later on started to ship many of its production line within China is actually the active government intervention by the Beijing government to make this as a process, rather than this is more of a market adjusting itself the result. So I have to say that the government actually play a much bigger role than a lot of people anticipated. And for this globalization, probably this is the issue that we can think about how to renew and make it a more humane and a justice globalization that we wanted it, so that a lot of the issues or problem that talked about by previous speakers, such as it deprived the prosperity opportunity for the developing countries, as well as the human capital development, that could give us opportunity this time to correct it. And I think one of the problem is that in the past, we are letting the market or the economy itself to have a say about the future trajectory. But a lot of other intangible things, such as the human capital, such as education, and the social distribution policy, those are the things that just cannot be done through the country by themselves. It needs to have a global solution and a global institute to coordinate all this. And one of the prime example is like the pandemic. It actually highlights the problem about the global disease, which cannot be tackled by any single country alone, even a stronger one. We still need a global cooperations so that we could avoid the a new wave or another different ways of the disease coming back and to hit us together. And this also basically highlights the need how to form a kind of the coalition willing, at least first, to address some of the tangibles that are not economic issues that wasn't really addressed in the past, or that had been left as in the marginal of their policy coordination. Right now, I believe those should be put at the center. And also, we need to come up with a measure for countries who willing to weaponize the interdependence, how the consequence of those countries should suffer. Because the weaponizing of interdependence will only cause the mutual destructions that are going to not only destroy the whole globalizing process, but also destroy all the benefit and the progress that we have made so far.
All right, Melissa, would you like to take that? And what kind of solutions do you see, political and institutional solutions that should actually come forward now when we look at countries navigating this era of deglobalization? Do you agree this is an era of deglobalization? And what kind of solutions do you see?
Well, if I'm looking at political solutions, I suppose I'd say I'm very wary of bringing security and trade together in the way that is happening in the current debate. I see them as different realms. You don't just trade with friends and allies, with nice countries that you like, because that impoverishes you and that impoverishes your people. You trade wherever there's mutual benefit. So it's not about equitable trade, it's about beneficial, mutually beneficial trade. And in the end, markets work that out. So if I'm thinking about Australia at the moment, we have a security and defence community which is actually trying very hard to bring trade inside the security concerns, to see that they have the overarching responsibility to decide on that. And to me, that's bringing so much of our society, our endeavour under this sort of security umbrella, or seeing it through a security lens. It means that things like exports suddenly turn into a dependency, which then should be stopped. And of course, that's not helped by countries which are weaponising trade, as President Lai has very clearly put. My view is the security community don't understand trade very well. in general, and vastly underestimate how important it is to the economy, to society, to the lives of citizens. So I know I'm not going to stop it, but if I could, I would like to de-link those two.
Absolutely. So we're running short on time. We have just a few minutes left now, another 7 minutes probably, and I would request, I would like all of you to make your final comments. Manish, if I may start your closing comments on that. If you look at this question and actually the central theme of this session about chain globalization and unshackling the lifelines and clogging the supply chains. What's the future to globalization? What's the way forward to diversification of supply chain?
Well, unshackled or tethered globalization is a larger politico-economic question. And so therefore, it is not only, as I have been repeatedly stressing and reiterating, only a commercial imperative. So therefore, as you will continue to find that if right-wing populism continues to rise across the world, you will definitely also see the attendant economic nationalism manifest itself. And that would automatically become the antithesis of globalization as we've known it over the past 3 or 4 decades. Coupled with that, what I think essentially the question is that how do you correct the inequities which have crept into globalization and have given, as an earlier speaker was correctly pointing out, certain countries the leverage to be able to weaponize those logistical supply routes for purposes other than commerce and trade. My own limited submission in this regard would be that globalization by its very nature and essence is inequitable, because ultimately globalization was earlier also led by the imperatives of commerce, and it will continue to be led by the imperatives of commerce. So therefore, if we need to correct this skew, governments will really have to weigh in, and concerted efforts will have to be made by customizing national policy in order to ensure that the inflow of goods and services, or even the outflow of goods and services, is not preponderant to a particular geography. And till the time you do not do it by regulation, till the time you do not do it by law, I'm afraid it is not going to happen.
All right. Thank you, Manish, for that. We have very limited time, maybe a minute to each of the speakers. And I would like to begin with you, Mr. Chung, your closing comments.
Thank you. Today's topic is very relevant and timely, I think. Thank you again for inviting me. Before the closing my remarks, I would like to emphasize that Korea and India do indeed commonly embrace the shared universal values such as the democracy, the free market economy, and the rule of law. With the deep friendship and the trust between our two leaders, the Korea and India are enjoying deeper ties of friendship than ever all fields. The relationship with India as a Korean special strategic partner and a central pillar of the Korean's new southern policy has deepened to yet another level. Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Chung, what are your comments? Final take?
I do not have much to say, especially I very much agree with the MP Manish he just said earlier. So he speaks for me and I agree with him 100%. So thank you very much.
All right. Before I move on to Melissa, Mr. Soren Gade, how do you see what is the future? Which way is globalization and diversification headed?
Yeah, I mean, globalization is here to stay, and protectionism is not the answer to anything. And you can also put it another way: if you want to go far, go with others. And with increasing tension among global players in view of the competition, we need, especially of course, the like-minded liberal democracies, but we all need to cooperate more than ever. So I think that's my final word. Thank you.
Melissa, do you agree with that? This is a time when we need to, even though we say we are in an era of deglobalization and most countries have taken unilateral decisions and most countries have tended to look inwards and become insular, but this is a time where you actually need to cooperate more and come together more. So what does the future look like?
Well, perhaps I don't see 2020 as such a major shift. I see a lot of continuities, and I think with Soren, I would say, we're not looking at deglobalization. I would expect, if I'm looking in the future, we're going to see a lot that looks the same as the moment, because comparative advantage doesn't change quickly. Australia is going to be good at sunshine and lifestyle and minerals, and we're still going to be good at that regardless. We're not going to suddenly turn into a manufacturing superpower because people would like us to produce more. So I think we're going to see a lot of the same trends and much less shift than perhaps people are talking about at the moment.
All right. Thank you so much for joining for that discussion. And a thing that is very, very clear is we do need diversification. Over-dependence, as the pandemic pointed out, has not been good for anyone. Over-dependence in supply chains. So unclogging and diversification is the need. But as one of the speakers pointed out, also the resilience of supply chain based on trust is what is the need of the hour. And the world needs to really cooperate more, as the pandemic has pointed out, the need to focus on welfare state and the questions about whether the states or the societies should be more libertarian. With that, we will end this session. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nagma.